Hello. So I've been reading this book, Chinese Thought from Confucius to Cook Ding by Roel Sterckx something. I can't pronounce his name. And so far, it's actually been a pretty fantastic book. I basically am like 4 hours done. 4 hours away from finishing the book. The pages, like the writing's not that big and the pages aren't that long. So even though it looks like there's a lot left here, there's about 4 hours of reading left. And this is going to be my thoughts on the book so far. The first thing that stuck out to me was how similar Chinese philosophy was to how people think in mainland China. I've always liked to read about Chinese history and to some extent like Chinese culture. And I guess it's like a no-brainer now that I think about it. Like Western philosophy is really how like Western people think. But Chinese philosophy is really how people in China think. So one of the things is like filial piety. If you bring honor to yourself, then you bring honor to the family. And if you bring honor to the family, then you can acquire status. And you should want to bring honor to yourself because it's going to bring honor to the family. Also, you should always give praise to your elders because they worked for so many years for you to feed your parents or to feed your family, and so you should give sacrifices for them, or you should go to their graves and do rituals and prayers and so on and so forth. And also, there's a big debate between different Chinese philosophers about whether filial piety makes you a good person or not, which I feel like in Western philosophy, maybe I'm just missing something. It's only the Christians who say that, like, from what I understand, it's only the Christians who say that if you take care of your parents, you're a good person. But in Chinese philosophy, they explicitly say if you take care of your parents, you're a good person. Whereas I don't think that like Aristotle, Socrates, or Plato argues this. I don't think Kant or Schopenhauer or Bentham, I don't think any of them make these kind of arguments, but Confucius, Mozi, and some of the other guys, Mohist or something, they do make these arguments. Another thing that was very characteristic of, I think, Chinese culture was these stories that some of the thinkers would share, which is that a harmonious society can only be achieved by people practicing basically their cultural scripts or like their cultural roles or the rituals that are prescribed to them. And they gave this story where someone who was attending to the crown for the king noticed that the king, or maybe it was the emperor, was sleeping outside without a blanket and it was really cold. And so he gave him a blanket. And when the king woke up, he asked who gave him this blanket. And it was the crown bearer, and he had the crown bearer executed. And the reason why he had him executed was because he stepped outside of his role. And basically the person who should have been giving him the blanket only received like a minimal punishment. This to me, even actually just East Asian culture in general, it seems very similar to East Asian culture where, for example, Japanese researchers will complain that they can't critique their more senior figures. You have to basically remain inside the role of like a subservient person until it is your time. Yeah, that like, I could call it maybe conformity. Maybe conformity to your cultural script, you shouldn't step outside of that. That's something that also struck me as like, wow, this philosophy really connects with like the modern mindset. And then I guess this other one is a bit of a no-brainer as well, now that I think about it, but the way that philosophy was done inside China was with very like vivid language or imagery. So like, for example, the yin and the yang was like supposed to be a mountain where whenever one side of the mountain receives light, there's a shadow that's casted as a result. And you can't have one without the other. And this language still holds true for how people just speak Chinese in general, actually. And to go to that point, I was recently listening to like Xi Jinping give a speech about like the tariffs and like Chinese economy. And he said that like the Chinese economy is like an ocean, and storms can wipe out like ponds, but storms can't wipe out oceans. If you're going to be an ocean, then you're expected to experience some storms. And he was relating this back to like the trade war that's going on with the US. So I thought that was kind of funny that those two things coincided really closely with me. Yeah, I didn't realize how loose just day-to-day Mandarin was, and hearing it spoken by Xi Jinping and also seeing the philosophers talk like this, yeah, this really goes to the point that like Chinese philosophy does really characterize how like modern Chinese culture is. And there were some also ideas that I found very unique to Chinese philosophy that I haven't seen written anywhere else, at least not this explicitly. And the one was that filial piety, like basically a lot of regard for your family or loyalty to your family or honoring of your family makes for a bad subject, like a bad, like someone who's in political office, it makes for a bad person who's in political office because they have more loyalty to their family than to the state. And some of the Chinese philosophers were arguing that family should be de-emphasized and that like in a utopian society, people would have loyalty to their state. That I haven't seen argued anywhere from my readings. Again, I haven't read everything in Western philosophy, but that's the first time I came across that idea. Another one was that obedience alone isn't enough to have a harmonious society, that you actually need ritual because freedom leaves too much room for like unharmonious behavior or like basically behavior that's far too outside the cultural norm that you've been allotted. That was also a bit unique to me in terms of like reading it for the first time. And then the last one, which I thought was super interesting, was that a classless society would be a chaotic society because if everybody is equal, then nobody has cultural scripts that they have to follow. And so this goes back to this idea of like behaving ritually is a big idea inside Chinese philosophy. A classless society would result in you having the freedom to do whatever you want. And so you wouldn't have to behave ritually, which means there wouldn't be harmony between everybody because everybody would be on the same level. Basically, the philosopher was arguing that the only reason why people get along now is because there is classes and those classes have behaviors that are expected with them. That's the first time I've heard of like the classless society debate, like in terms of economic history, but to say that a classless society would be chaotic because of too much freedom to behave, that was a unique argument. Something else that kind of stuck out to me as well were the similarities between Eastern or say like Chinese philosophy and Western philosophy in general. So there's this group of people who are called the legalists. And a lot of the legalists in Chinese philosophy, they're not like people who specialize in law per se. The translation's a bit weird, but basically you can almost say they're like pragmatists who prefer like useful outcomes for society rather than maximizing pleasure. So they have Confucius has this whole thing about like music and how music is like a good example of like living without purpose and living in the moment. And I think he relates it back to like the Tao. The legalists didn't like music because it was something that was done that didn't have utility for the benefits of society. Basically like these, like you could maybe say like radical pragmatists. That's kind of what legalists were. So there were some similarities there, just different names, like same attitudes, different names. There was also the philosopher king type of arguments. So I think one or two of the philosophers I read inside the book argued that a emperor should be like isolated from society and should be highly educated. And as a result, they'll make the wisest decisions because they've not been poisoned by the people who have an incentive to control the emperor, right? The court, so to speak, has this toxic level of politics and self-serving behavior that an isolated emperor wouldn't be exposed to. And if they're highly educated, they would be like a wise leader. That seems pretty much like synonymous with philosopher kings. And the last one that I noticed for similarities was egoism. But the way egoism is communicated inside this book was more to do with like, you shouldn't make yourself too useful. They gave this story of like the unhealthy tree is the last tree to be cut down if someone's coming to look for like wood to do carpentry with. And so if you're making yourself too useful to society, then as a result, there's going to be more burdens on you and more demands from you, and you won't be able to live how you want to live. And so this philosopher was arguing that you should avoid taking up public office and things like this because you want to live the best way you can with your allotted amount of time under the kingdom of heaven, right? That was his idea. And I think that like, that is like egoism almost mixed with like not like the way when I think of it in the West, I think of someone who has like apathy and nihilism, right? They don't want to be involved in society. They don't want to do anything. Except this case, it's not apathy. It's almost like carefreeness or a lack of concern to do better. It's not apathy. Almost comes off as like negative. This doesn't seem like apathy. It almost seems like enthusiastic and like laziness. That's what it comes off as. And this kind of made me think about like the old question about nature and nurture. The fact that there are similarities between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and the fact that some of these philosophies characterize modern Chinese psychology or like modern Chinese culture, makes me wonder how much of this is due to environmental factors shaping people's cognitions versus the human brain only has so many possible ways to conceive of something that the probability that we have similarities between cultures, despite different words, is actually quite high because there's just only so many ways of conceiving things, right? It is an interesting question, and I was very, very shocked to see how many similarities there were between Western and Chinese thought. And it makes me want to go a little bit deeper into comparative philosophy, just to see how much similarities there's going to be between other nations' philosophies or other people's philosophies, and just the general Western philosophy that I've been exposed to. If you've read this book, or if you have any other recommendations for Chinese philosophy, there's a few other books that I'm going to get that people have recommended, but I'm open for more recommendations. I'd be happy to hear them, and I'm happy to hear what you think about if you read this book. And that being said, bye-bye.